The gang kidnapped my 3-year-old son to retaliate against my police officer husband. To save him, I volunteered to replace him as the hostage. Unexpectedly, the bomb was detonated prematurely, leaving me severely injured and mentally impaired. Upon waking, the doctor announced that I had suffered a miscarriage and my intelligence had regressed to that of a 4-year-old child. My husband held my hand tightly, promising never to abandon me. Thus, I screamed uncontrollably at the commendation ceremony and embarrassed myself publicly at the parent-teacher meeting. He never complained, always quietly cleaning up the mess behind me. Until my son's 10th birthday. I wanted to give him 1,000 paper cranes that I had learned to fold after much effort. But they were snatched away by a group of children, and I was even chased and mocked by them with firework sticks. I screamed in fright, accidentally knocking over the birthday cake and ruining my son's birthday. The guests pointed and whispered. My husband dragged me back to the attic. His eyes reddened, and for the first time, he roared at me, "Raina, isn't torturing me enough? Do you have to ruin our son too?" Seeing his ferocious expression, I huddled in fear, hugging my head. "I'm sorry, I was wrong, I really know I was wrong. Don't hit me." Seeing the burn on my arm, my husband froze, as if all his strength had been drained. "Why didn't you die in that explosion?" At that very moment, the fog in my mind cleared, and my consciousness returned to clarity. I slowly released my hands from hugging my head and looked up. The white hair at Miles' temples was strikingly noticeable. His once sharp eyes were now filled with bloodshot veins, brimming with an inexhaustible fatigue. Before I could sort out my thoughts, I subconsciously stood up and opened my arms to hug him. But as soon as I moved, he grabbed my wrist with force that made me wince in pain. Before I could react, he had pulled me to the old bed in the corner of the attic. "Don't move." His voice was terribly hoarse. I watched as he skillfully took out the handcuffs and clicked my left hand to the bedpost. "Stay here properly, and don't come downstairs until the party is over." Seeing the tears welling up from the pain, Miles' tone softened involuntarily. "Raina, I'm begging you, don't cause any more trouble, okay?" Just as I was about to speak, I saw our son behind him. The little child stood at the door, his eyes swollen and red, with dried tear stains on his face. My heart tightened, and I struggled to lift my uncuffed hand, opening my palm where a crooked 1,000 paper crane made of colored paper lay quietly. The colored paper had softened from the sweat in my palm. "Sonny, sorry." I forced a smile, my voice dry and hoarse. "Happy birthday." Our son stared fixedly at the paper crane, his small chest heaving violently. Suddenly, he snatched it, tore it to shreds in a few moves, threw it harshly on the ground, and stomped on it several times in frustration. "I hate you." His gaze toward me was full of grievance and resentment, shouting in a tearful voice, "Why don't you just disappear? I hate you. I hate you the most." His words were like a blunt knife, repeatedly cutting into my heart. "Sonny," Miles sternly reprimanded, "who taught you to speak like that? She's your mother. If it weren't for her saving you back then." "I don't want her to save me." Our son screamed, interrupting him, pouting in grievance with large tears rolling down. "They all laugh at me for having a retarded mom. Why did you let her save me?" He cried out, like an enraged little beast, rushing fiercely in front of me and raising his fists to hit me. "So the child I risked my life to save hates me this much?" I stared blankly at him, momentarily forgetting to dodge, letting the small fists rain down on me like drops. Miles' face turned ashen, yanking our son away and raising his hand. "Enough. I see you won't learn without a lesson today." "Miles, don't." A gentle female voice sounded. Angela appeared at the door. She quickly stepped forward, shielding Sonny behind her, gently patting his back, and softly comforting, "Sonny, don't cry, today is your birthday, let's not think about unhappy things, okay?" She turned to Miles, her tone disapproving, "That's not how you educate a child. The child is still young, his birthday was ruined like this today, it's normal to say wrong things out of grievance, why argue with him? Don't scare him." As she spoke, Angela naturally linked her arm with his. "I've calmed the guests downstairs, you father and son should go down quickly, it's Sunny's birthday today. What does it look like if the protagonist is absent? Miles' tense shoulders relaxed slightly, his gaze toward Angela full of gratitude and admiration. Thank you for your hard work. The three of them left the narrow attic like that. I stared fixedly at Angela's hand linked with Miles' arm, my nails digging deep into my palm, leaving crescent-shaped blood marks. The attic returned to silence. I struggled to move to the small window, looking at the lawn downstairs. Miles and Angela held our son's small hands, cutting a new cake together. The scene was harmonious, like a family of three. But I was like a ghost that couldn't see the light, locked in the dark attic. I bit my lower lip hard until a salty sweetness spread in my mouth, without letting go. I leaned against the cold wall, slowly sliding down to sit on the ground. I don't know how long passed, fatigue overwhelmed me like a tide, and my consciousness gradually blurred. In a daze, I heard the sound of the door opening. It seemed someone picked me up, and a very light sigh fell into my ear. Raina, what on earth should I do with you? The next day. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself no longer in the attic, but lying on the soft big bed in the bedroom. The handcuffs on my wrist had been unlocked at some point, leaving only a faint red mark. The wounds on my palm and lips felt the cool touch of ointment, obviously applied carefully by someone while I was asleep. The door was gently pushed open, and Miles walked in with breakfast. Raina, don't hurt yourself to attract my attention anymore. His voice was low and hoarse, carrying the fatigue of a sleepless night, and I was stunned. So in his eyes, I was just like a child using extreme methods to compete for attention. I'm not. I wanted to explain, but he didn't want to listen at all, interrupting mercilessly. I'm not a Superman, I still have work, and Sunny to take care of. I can't revolve around you every moment. He placed the breakfast on the bedside table, picked up the bowl, scooped a spoonful of porridge, blew it cool gently, and handed it to my lips. I can do it myself. I reached out to do it myself. Miles frowned slightly. Don't throw a tantrum, eat properly. I didn't. I insisted on reaching for it. Our hands touched at the bowl's edge, and in the struggle, the whole bowl of hot porridge suddenly overturned. The sticky rice porridge spilled on the bedsheet, and Miles' hand back instantly turned red. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I panicked and jumped out of bed, grabbing tissues to wipe. I just wanted to prove that I can do it alone, without depending on you for everything. Miles suddenly grabbed my wrist with force that made me wince. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, his chest heaving violently. Finally, he let out a very light scoff, unsure if mocking my words or himself. I'm begging you. He opened his eyes, the bottom filled with bloodshot, the fatigue in his tone almost overwhelming me. Don't make more trouble, okay? My heart felt like it was tightly gripped by an invisible hand, sour self-blame spreading in my chest. At that moment, Angela pushed the door open. She was dressed in casual clothes today, looking exceptionally youthful and vibrant. Miles, are you ready? We promised Sunny to arrive at the amusement park before 10. Her voice was light and bright, clashing with the oppressive atmosphere in the bedroom. Seeing the mess on the bed and Miles' scalded red hand back, Angela's smile froze on her face. Miles withdrew his hand and briefly explained. There was an accident, might have to delay. But you promised me. Our son stood at the door at some point, his eyes slightly red, small hands tightly gripping the door frame. Miles sighed helplessly. Sonny, Dad needs to handle something first. He glared at me fiercely, turned and ran back to his room, slamming the door with a bang, followed by cries. Perhaps in their eyes, I was still that clueless fool. She and Miles ignored me like that, arguing in front of me. Miles, how many times do you have to wrong Sunny for Raina? Angela's voice carried suppressed anger. Have you thought about his feelings? He already doesn't have a normal mom. Do you want him to lose his dad's company too? Miles rubbed his brow. Angela, stop. I insist on saying it. Angela stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. For these 7 years, you've personally taken care of her, even if it's atonement, it should be done by now. Moreover, what happened back then wasn't your fault at all. It was those deranged criminals. It's not atonement. Miles suddenly looked up, his voice rising sharply. Raina's dad saved me. Before he died I swore to take care of Raina for life. Now she's like this because of me. This is what I owe her. Then don't you owe me? Angela's tears finally fell. It was me who accompanied you out of depression, and me who helped you take care of this home that originally had nothing to do with me. Miles, I'm 30 this year, not young anymore. Do you know how much pressure I'm under? Today is the last time I ask you, if you still insist. She took a deep breath, wiped the tears from her face, her gaze toward Miles carrying a resolute smile. Then I'll let go home, and marry someone else. The words, marry someone else, were like a heavy hammer. It shattered all of Miles' feigned calm. I saw his fingers tremble slightly, his Adam's apple bobbing, finally as if all strength was drained. He stepped forward, hugging Angela tightly. Wait for me, his voice low and hoarse, carrying a vulnerability I'd never heard. Give me a little more time. I'll handle all this. Angela sobbed lightly in his arms, her hands hugging his waist back. I stood in the center of the messy bedroom, watching my husband hold another woman, promising to solve me this trouble. Sunlight shone through the window, exactly on their embracing figures, so warm, so harmonious. So the home I once risked my life to protect no longer had a place for me. Miles saw Angela out, both ignoring me. I stood there, looking at the messy porridge stains on the floor, the void in my heart broken by their promise, whistling with cold wind. After a long time, I moved my steps toward our son's room. The door was ajar. I gently pushed it open and saw our son lying on the bed, his small shoulders still shrugging slightly from sobbing. "Sonny." I spoke hoarsely. He turned sharply, seeing it was me, his eyes instantly bursting with strong anger, grabbing the pillow beside him and throwing it hard at me. "Get out. I hate you. I don't want to see you." The pillow hit me softly, not hurting. I bent down to pick it up, patted it, walked step by step to the bed, and handed the pillow back to him. Looking at his eyes full of tears yet filled with hatred, my voice was somewhat dry. "Do you hate me that much?" Sonny was stunned, seemingly not expecting me to ask so calmly. He could tell that at this moment, I was no longer the mentally impaired mother who only giggled foolishly or dodged in fear. A trace of confusion flashed across his tender face, but he was too young to understand what it meant. That bit of confusion was quickly covered by stronger emotions. "Because you're an idiot. As long as you're here, you'll embarrass me," he shouted sharply, forcefully waving away my hand offering the pillow. Aunt Angela wouldn't. She knows everything. She'll accompany me to assemble difficult models, tell me stories I don't know, and help me with homework. My classmates all like her. Why are you my mom? Every word our son said was like an ice-quenched nail, piercing my heart full of holes. Bitterness surged in my heart, almost overwhelming me. Unwillingly, with a trace of hope I couldn't even detect myself, I asked softly, if Mom isn't stupid anymore, becomes like before, would you still want Aunt Angela to be your mom? Sonny's face showed some hesitation, but after meeting my gaze, he stiffened his neck and stubbornly said, "Of course. Aunt Angela is better than you. I want her to be my mom." The last glimmer of light faded. As I gazed upon this son, whom I had risked my life to save, sacrificing another unborn child and my own lucid existence, my heart felt as though it were being crushed by an invisible hand, the pain so intense it nearly robbed me of breath. After a while, I nodded very lightly, my voice drifting like a sigh. "Okay. Mom knows, and will do as you wish." After saying that, I no longer looked at his dazed expression, turned and left his room. That night, when the villa had completely fallen into sleep, I quietly entered the study and used the computer to check recent flight information. Though Miles has been utterly exhausted these past years, he never touched the savings I had set aside while I was still lucid. The balance on that card is enough for me to leave here and start over somewhere where no one knows me. A few days later, it was the day for the routine checkup. Miles accompanied me sitting in the clinic, handing the latest diagnostic report to the doctor. At that moment, his phone in his pocket vibrated, the screen lit up, and I clearly glimpsed the jumping name, Angela. He glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, and while the doctor lowered his head to look at the report, he got up and went outside to answer. Only the doctor and I remained in the clinic. The doctor carefully flipped through the report, gradually showing a relieved smile on his face. He looked up at me, his tone light. "Mrs. Reyna, congratulations. From various assessments, your cognitive functions have basically returned to normal. This is truly a miracle. Mr. Miles hasn't had it easy these years. Finally the bitterness ends and sweetness comes." But I interrupted his blessing. "Doctor," I looked at Miles outside the clinic door, speaking in a low voice on the phone, trying to make my voice sound normal. "Can you keep it secret for me first?" The doctor was somewhat surprised. I lowered my eyelashes and said softly, "I want to find a suitable opportunity to tell him personally, give him a surprise." The doctor smiled understandingly upon hearing, "Of course." I curved my lips, gripping the old phone in my pants pocket. Recalling last night when looking for the phone and card, I unexpectedly found the divorce certificate. That was when I was still mentally impaired. Angela coaxed me to sign the divorce power of attorney, and she divorced me and Miles on our behalf. When Miles discovered he had been tricked into signing the divorce agreement and found that power of attorney, he flew into a rage, questioning Angela on what right she had to divorce us on behalf. But she blocked him with one sentence: "Sonny is going to elementary school. Do you still want Sonny to be mocked for having an idiot mom?" He was silent, only telling Angela not to interfere in his and my affairs anymore. I don't know what he was really thinking. After that day, he still took care of me as before, but never mentioned remarrying me. Perhaps from that moment, he had made his choice. I lowered my head, looking at the message on the phone screen showing successful ticket booking. After returning from the hospital, Miles began to zone out often, sometimes staring at me in a daze. Finally, when he held beautifully printed nursing home brochures and gently asked if I liked them, I realized that while I was preparing to leave, he was also preparing to send me away. I forced a smile looking at those brochures, but didn't say good or bad. Every day, when they weren't noticing, I quietly stuffed one or two old items into the small box hidden in the corner of the cloakroom. The night before leaving, at the dinner table, Sonny poked at his rice, his voice carrying cautious anticipation. "Dad, tomorrow, we're having a parent-teacher meeting, can you come?" In the past, Miles always used taking care of me as an excuse and let Angela handle it. The air froze for a few seconds. Miles' gaze swept over me, eating quietly with my head down, silent for a moment, finally, as if making some determination. "Okay, Dad and Aunt Angela will go together." Sonny's eyes lit up instantly, his face bursting with joyful light, stinging my eyes. I lowered my head, silently swallowing the bitterness in my throat. The next day, I watched them leave. Estimating the time, I picked up the not-too-heavy suitcase and walked toward the door. However, just as I reached the living room, the door was pushed open by Angela, who had returned. She was dressed appropriately, obviously carefully groomed. Seeing my expression different from the usual mentally impaired confusion, her smile froze instantly, her gaze suddenly sharp. "Reyna?" She looked me up and down, her tone carrying disbelief and a trace of barely noticeable panic. You're better?" She quickly approached, lowering her voice. "What do you want to do? Want to go to the parent-teacher meeting to cause trouble? I tell you, don't waste your effort. This home has no place for you anymore." Looking at her as if facing a great enemy, I actually found it somewhat amusing. "You misunderstood," I said calmly, my voice slightly hoarse. "I'm not going to the parent-teacher meeting, I'm leaving." I paused, looking at her. "So, Miss Angela, you don't need to target me anymore." Since I attended the parent-teacher meeting for my son and made a fool of myself, I was no longer allowed to participate in my son's activities. The last birthday party was an accident. It was she who coaxed the mentally impaired me that Sonny liked 1,000 paper cranes. It was also she who pointed at the group of children playing with fireworks, saying Sonny was among them, telling me to go find him. If it were me 7 years ago, I couldn't have swallowed this anger. But now, arguing seems meaningless. Angela obviously didn't believe my words. Her eyes flickered with suspicion and vigilance. At that moment, Miles' voice came from outside. "Angela, did you find the thing? We need to hurry." Hearing the urging, Angela's face changed, suddenly reaching out to grab my arm, her tone urgent with coercion. "You can't go out." I subconsciously waved her hand away, not wanting to entangle with her. "Ah. I didn't use much force." But Angela exclaimed, staggering backward and falling to the ground. Her face instantly filled with pain and grievance. Just at that moment, Miles pushed the door open, seeing exactly the scene of her sitting on the ground. "Raina." Miles' face changed suddenly, rushing over in a few steps to support Angela. He looked up at me, his eyes full of undisguised disappointment and anger. "What madness are you up to again? Apologize." "I didn't push her." I looked at him steadily. Angela leaned in his arms, forcing a smile. "Miles, don't blame Raina. She might have heard we and Sunny are going to the parent-teacher meeting without her, feeling uncomfortable. After all, her situation is special. I'm fine, really fine." Her seemingly considerate words were like adding fuel to the fire. Miles looked at the red scrape on Angela's knee, frowning tightly. Looking again at me, who refused to apologize, the veins on his forehead throbbed. He scooped Angela up horizontally, without looking at me, sternly instructing the nanny who came upon hearing, "Take her to the attic. Without my permission, don't let her come down." After saying that, he carried Angela and strode away. The door closed with a bang. I stood there, looking at the closed door. After a moment, I bent down to pick up the suitcase. The nanny hesitated forward. "Madam, sir said to take you to the attic." I straightened up, looked at her, my gaze clear and calm. "Aunt, I'm better." Aunt was stunned, looking at me in astonishment. I ignored her, dragged the suitcase, and walked toward the door without looking back. On the other side, Miles had just settled Angela, who had only a minor scrape. He called Sunny's class teacher, patiently explaining to his son on the phone that they would be late. Hanging up, he tiredly rubbed his brow, looked up, and bumped into Raina's attending doctor. "Mr. Miles? Why are you here? Is Mrs. Raina uncomfortable somewhere?" The doctor saw him too and came over concernedly to ask. "No," Miles shook his head, "a friend accidentally fell." The doctor sighed in relief. "That's good. Mrs. Raina has just recovered. It's a critical period. The family must pay more attention at this stage, avoid stimulation." "Wait." Miles suddenly interrupted him, pupils contracting. "Doctor, you just said, who recovered?" "Mrs. Raina. The last checkup results were very good, cognitive level basically back to normal." The doctor was stunned by his question, subconsciously asking back, "What? It's been some days, didn't she tell you?" Miles was struck as if by lightning, stiff in place, his face draining of color. The doctor didn't notice Miles' abnormality, still saying, "Mrs. Raina also said she wanted to tell you personally, give you a surprise." "Surprise?" Miles only felt cold all over. Involuntarily staggering back a few steps, his heel hitting the cold corridor wall, barely steadying his almost limp body. In his mind, recent abnormalities of Raina flashed like lightning. Yes. During this time, she began not needing him to feed her step by step, even indicating she could do it herself when he reached out. Her eyes occasionally showed a clarity that was familiar yet strange to him. Those details he had ignored, roughly attributing to throwing tantrums, now linked into a clear clue. Then these days. Miles couldn't help recalling the nursing homes he showed Raina these days. Those scenes were like a rope, tightly strangling his neck, making it hard to breathe. Huge panic like a tsunami instantly engulfed him, followed by overwhelming regret, sharp enough to pierce every nerve. "Mr. Miles? Are you okay?" the doctor asked worriedly. Miles turned a deaf ear, suddenly turning around, almost staggering toward the elevator, his fingers trembling as he pressed the down button again and again, as if a second slower would be hell. He pulled out his phone, frantically dialing Raina's number. "Hello, the number you dialed is powered off." The cold prompt sound was like a heavy hammer, shattering his last bit of hope. He abandoned everything, like a crazed trapped beast, rushing into the parking lot, starting the car, the engine emitting a piercing roar, the car shooting out like an arrow from the string. On the way, how many red lights he ran, how many cars he overtook, he no longer knew. Only one thought in his mind: go home. Go home immediately. Find Reina. He rushed into the villa, the entrance terribly quiet. Reina! Reina! He hoarsely shouted, his voice echoing in the empty living room, getting no response. He stumbled up to the second floor, pushing open the bedroom door. The room was excessively tidy, as if no one had lived there. Only on the bedside table were two things. A ring made from an ordinary soda can pull tab. Due to the passage of time, the tab had faded somewhat, the edges smoothed from rubbing. That was when they first got together. He had nothing, on the playground using all his clumsy romance to put on her this promise. She had smiled, saying it was the most precious gift she ever received, always cherishing it. Next to the pull tab, pressed a note. On it was familiar yet slightly unsteady handwriting, obviously not long after recovering writing ability: as you wish, I'm gone. Wish you happiness. Reina. The short sentence was like a red-hot iron, scorching his eyes, branding into his heart. As you wish. He suddenly recalled that on his son's birthday, in the attic with red eyes, the words he roared at her. Ah! Miles could no longer hold on, his knees weakened, heavily kneeling on the cold floor. Huge grief and regret like a tide completely submerged him. Scenes from the past 10 years rewound crazily before his eyes. She in police uniform, smile bright and confident, standing shoulder to shoulder with him at the bomb disposal site. When she learned she was pregnant, the gentle glow of first-time motherhood on her face. To save her son, she unhesitatingly walked toward the bandit tied with a bomb, looking back at him with a glance resolute yet affectionate. After she became mentally impaired, ignorantly depending on him, following behind, sweetly calling him Brother Miles. Each time she caused trouble, that helpless, terrified look. He thought he had paid a lot these 7 years, suffering torment. But for Reina, these 7 years were nothing less than a cruel, lingering death. He resented her for dragging him down, hated her for shaming him and his son, but forgot, she became like this for whom? He kept talking about responsibility and guilt, but in the day-after-day fatigue, turned the home she once risked her life to protect into a cage, imprisoning her, even personally pushing her away toward another woman. He thought what he lost was just a trouble that required his effort to care for. But in reality, it was the light buried deep in his heart since youth, the wife he swore to protect with his life, the woman who could unhesitatingly sacrifice everything for him and the child. Miles' heart felt like it was rawly gouged out, leaving a bloody hole whistling with draught. He curled up on the cold floor, in the empty house, only his desperate cries echoing. Miles mobilized all usable resources and connections, madly searching for Reina's traces. He found her ticket record to a southern province, but she got off midway, took a bus, and the clue ended there. She seemed to have evaporated from the world. Anxiety and regret gnawed at him day and night. Until that day, in the study sorting Reina's left items, reminiscing, he opened the home monitoring system back-end. That was installed when Sonny was little, to check on the child anytime. As if possessed, he retrieved the door surveillance video from the day I left. In the footage, I carried a simple suitcase, meeting Angela at the door. It clearly recorded how Angela blocked me, how she fell backward herself when I tried to leave, the truth like a poisoned dagger, dissecting all disguises. Miles called Angela in front of him, his voice trembling from suppressed anger, playing that surveillance. You've been lying to me all along. You deliberately provoked her. You couldn't wait for her to leave. Angela's face instantly paled. She tried to explain, her voice carrying habitual grievance. Miles, listen to me, I just care too much about you, too much about this home. I couldn't stand seeing you so tired. Care? Miles scoffed, that laugh full of self-mockery and desolation. What you care about is yourself. You used my fatigue and negligence, step by step forcing her away. Get out. I don't want to see you again. The resoluteness and disgust in his eyes completely crushed Angela. She finally understood that all calculations and disguises turned to bubbles at this moment. She left dejectedly, carrying unwillingness and resentment. And Sonny, after the initial ignorant relief passed, began to taste the flavor of loss. The home no longer had that mom who would be at a loss and silently cry because of his hate. Breakfast was no longer Dad's hastily heated milk and bread, but completely takeout. Dad's smiles on his face became fewer, often sitting alone on the sofa, staring blankly at that ridiculous soda can pull tab. He began to have insomnia at night, hugging his knees sitting on the bed. The home was empty, terribly quiet. He recalled that on his birthday, the 1,000-paper crane he tore and stomped. Recalling Mom's eyes looking at him then, sad yet understanding. A strange, sour emotion spread in his small heart. He seemed, not really hoping Mom would disappear. Sea breeze carrying salty humidity surged into the window. I stood in the newly rented house, gazing at the distant sea horizon where the sun set. This was a southern coastal small town so quiet it was almost forgotten by time, completely different from the city where I lived for over 30 years. My life gears stalled for 7 years began to turn again. Updating documents, checking assets, every matter reminded me, Raina, you should start over. Finally, I began to pick up the skills I had lost before. I tried some fine hand exercises. But the results were always discouraging. Whenever I tried to pick up familiar tools, my hands uncontrollably trembled slightly. More terrifying was the psychological barrier. The loud drill from downstairs renovation could make my face pale instantly, almost instinctively wanting to find cover and squat, the shadow of that explosion still following like a shadow. Can I still go back? The answer to the question was as blurry as the sea fog before me. Outside the window, neon lights lit up. I gathered my coat. The nights here are very quiet, clearly hearing the waves crashing on the rocks, again and again, like washing away the past, also like questioning the future. The sea breeze gently blew the flower shop's doorbell, making a crisp sound. I was carefully trimming a bunch of champagne roses, enjoying this long-lost tranquility. Here, no one knew my past, no one looked at me with strange eyes. The boss lady Lynn treated me very gently, never asking about my origins. Raina, can you put that basket of sunflowers at the door? I nodded, picked up the flower basket and walked to the door. At that moment, a deafening loud noise came from the street corner, a truck tire burst. My hands trembled fiercely, the flower basket nearly slipping. My heart uncontrollably pounded, forehead instantly covered in fine cold sweat. The shadow of that explosion still followed like a shadow. Are you okay? Lynn came over concernedly. I forced down the palpitation in my heart, gently shaking my head. Such stress reactions, I don't know how long they will last. Whenever a loud noise comes, that day's scene clearly emerges before my eyes, the glaring firelight, deafening explosion, and the ensuing severe pain. Thousands of miles away, Miles finally mustered the courage to enter that long-sealed attic again. While sorting my old items, his fingers suddenly touched a hardcover notebook. The cover had 3 crooked little figures drawn with crayons. That was my handwriting from the mentally impaired period. With trembling hands, he opened the first page. It had 3 little figures holding hands, below written, Miles, Sunny, Raina, together forever. Page by page, the childish doodles recorded my bits and pieces. One page had childish handwriting, today learned to fold 1,000-paper cranes, want to give to Sunny as birthday gift. Beside it was a crooked 1,000-paper crane drawing. Until the son's birthday, all records stopped abruptly. The last page had only 1 line, so, I was already the extra one. Miles held that diary, sitting in the attic all night. When morning light sprinkled through the window, his eyes were severely swollen. At that moment, the phone rang urgently. It was Sunny's class teacher calling. Rushing to school, Sunny was standing head down in the office, face with obvious scratches. The other parent aggressively, Mr. Miles, your son hit mine just because my son said a joke, this upbringing is too poor. He said Mom was forced away by me, I'm an unwanted child, even if Mom is an idiot, she doesn't want me. Sunny suddenly looked up, his red eyes full of tears, I didn't mean it. I didn't know Mom would leave. Miles squatted down, for the first time not blaming his son, but gently wiping his tears, Dad knows. Mom's matter isn't your fault. That night, Sonny developed a high fever. At the sickbed, he dazedly held Miles' hand, choking, "Dad, I miss Mom. I regret it." Just when Miles was almost swallowed by despair, a turning point quietly appeared. After a case analysis meeting, he heard two colleagues chatting in the pantry. Heard? In Nowlin City, there's someone, said to be a former female police officer, helped citizens defuse a suspected explosive a few days ago. Really? What's the name? The report didn't write the full name, just said Raina. The photo is quite blurry. Miles rushed over suddenly, grabbing the colleague's phone. The news image was indeed blurry, only a side profile visible. But his heartbeat accelerated suddenly. That was Raina. Even through the blurry pixels, he could recognize her at a glance. It's her. It's really her. His voice trembled with excitement, eyes red. I found her. I finally found her. 3 hours later, Miles boarded the flight to Nowlin City. I was sorting the newly arrived flowers. Sunlight through the glass window danced fine golden lights on the petals. The wind chimes at the flower shop door made a crisp sound. "Welcome." I looked up, my words stopping abruptly. Miles stood at the door, travel-worn, the whole person like having gone through a long ordeal. He wore a wrinkled shirt, tie loosely hanging, chin with blue stubble, eyes sunken, filled with bloodshot. "Raina." His voice was terribly hoarse, carrying cautious probing, as if afraid to disturb something. I put down the flower shears in my hand, calmly gazing at him. No imagined anger, no excitement of long-separated reunion, only a calmness that surprised even myself, like looking at a familiar stranger. "How did you find here?" He quickly stepped forward, wanting to hold my hand, but I gently avoided it. This action made his gaze dim instantly. "I searched for a long time." His voice carried a choke. "Raina, I'm sorry, I know I was wrong, I really know I was wrong. Come home with me, Sonny, and I need you." I gently shook my head, my gaze passing him, falling on the blue sea outside the window. "That's not my home anymore." My voice was light, yet exceptionally firm. "Between us, there's 7 years of pain, an unborn child, and a divorce certificate. Can't go back." His face instantly pale as paper. "The divorce certificate, I can explain, that was Angela. It doesn't matter anymore." I interrupted him, tone calm as if talking about someone else. "Miles, look, I'm doing well now. I'm undergoing rehabilitation training, although my hands still tremble at loud noises. Maybe can't return to the bomb disposal front line, but I'm trying to start over. My future no longer needs you to be responsible." He looked at me, his gaze from expectation to despair, finally turning to deep pain. Those once sharp eyes now held emotions I couldn't understand. After a long time, he took a deep breath, as if using all his strength. "I understand." Unexpectedly, he didn't entangle, just looked deeply at me, that gaze complex enough to make me dazed for a moment. Then he turned, pushed the door and left the flower shop, his back figure exceptionally desolate in the afternoon sunlight. I originally thought he would leave. But after leaving that day, Miles rented a small house not far from the flower shop, starting to learn to guard me in another way. Every week, the flower shop would receive a special order. A bunch of fresh sunflowers, always attached with an unsigned card. "Today's sunshine is good, suitable for going out for a walk. Rehabilitation training should be gradual, don't force yourself too much." I knew it was him. The handwriting on those cards, I was too familiar with, even if he deliberately changed the writing style. What surprised me more was that I successively received several rehabilitation training manuals, with notes carefully pasted, marking key chapters. Lynn said it was a tall man who placed them at the shop door, coming and going hastily. I didn't expose it, nor refuse. These materials were indeed helpful for my rehabilitation. I had no reason to refuse progress because of peak. However, the peaceful days didn't last too long. That evening, I finished rehabilitation training and went home, the setting sun pulling my shadow very long. Walking in the familiar alley, I always felt someone watching me in the dark. It was a long-absent, creepy feeling. I turned sharply, but only saw empty streets and swaying tree shadows. Maybe an illusion, I quickened my steps. At the corner, I glimpsed a blurry figure quickly hiding into the alley. That figure's posture was inexplicably familiar, reminding me of those vicious faces 7 years ago. My heart sank suddenly, palms seeping cold sweat. After detecting seeming tracking that day, it seemed like my illusion. For several consecutive days, no more feeling of being monitored. Until one weekend afternoon, Lynn was hit by a car and injured, had to ask me for help. I went on behalf of Lynn to the warehouse near the dock to inventory new flowers. This place was relatively remote, narrow lanes between warehouses, piled with discarded wooden boxes and fishing nets. Inventory finished, it was already sunset, sky gradually darkening. I carried the empty box out of the warehouse, the lane unusually quiet, only distant waves sound. That feeling of being peeped at came again, stronger than any time before. I quickened my steps, heart accelerating uncontrollably. Just as I was about to exit the lane, two tall men in black jackets flashed out from the dark, blocking my way front and back. Their hat brims pressed low, but I recognized at a glance the hideous scar on one man's neck. 7 years ago, it was he who kidnapped Sonny, later subdued by me with a stun gun, forced to reveal their kidnapping location of Sonny. Officer Reyna, long time no see. The scar man pulled a cold smile, slowly approaching. Finding you was really not easy. I forced myself to calm, slowly retreating, back against the cold wall. Cold sweat instantly soaked my back. They came prepared, choosing this place without surveillance, rarely visited. Now it seems Lynn's leg injury may not be unrelated to them. What? Miles ruined our business, caught our big brother, this account, someone has to pay. The other man approached viciously. You don't want that flower shop boss lady to have an accident, right? It has nothing to do with her. I forced myself to calm down, but my voice carried a barely noticeable tremble. Whatever it is, come at me. Come at you? The other short sturdy man scoffed, pulling a dagger from his back waist. Of course come at you. Heard you were stupid for 7 years? Pity, now you're better, just right to clearly feel. His words not finished, he pounced at me fiercely. Just as he reached to grab me, stop. A familiar roar exploded like thunder. A black shadow rushed out swiftly from behind the side debris pile, kicking hard at the waist of the thug closest to me. The man caught off guard, screamed and fell. It was Miles. How was he here? Reyna, dodge. He pulled me behind him, using his body to block in front, gaze sharp as an eagle, tightly staring at the remaining knife-holding thug. After brief astonishment, the two thugs pounced simultaneously. Miles barehanded, entangled in fight with them. His skills still agile, but the opponents had knives, obviously desperados, every move vicious. Bang! A muffled sound, fist to flesh. Miles grunted, a cut opened on his forehead, blood instantly flowing down. That glaring red, like lightning splitting the area in my mind frozen by fear. At the same time, a nearby car's alarm was triggered by the huge fighting noise, emitting a sharp piercing sound. Beep beep beep. My brain blank, the fear of that explosion seized me again. Loud noise, firelight, tearing pain. No. I can't be like this anymore. At that time, the other thug spotted an opening, raised the dagger to stab Miles' back heart. Careful! I exclaimed involuntarily. Almost instinctively, I fiercely grabbed the fire extinguisher at the wall corner. Now! I rushed over, using all strength to pull the safety pin of one fire extinguisher, aiming at the scar man entangled with Miles, fiercely pressing the handle. Puff, large amounts of dry powder sprayed out, instantly filling the entire lane, also covering the scar man's head and face. Caught off guard, he coughed violently, his movements stalled. Miles seized this fleeting opportunity, a neat capture, disarming his weapon, slamming him hard to the ground, knee firmly pressing his back. Almost at the same time, the short sturdy man saw his companion subdued, gaze ruthless, desperately raising the dagger again rushing at Miles' back. Left. I reminded sharply. Miles sidestepped to dodge while delivering a sharp backswing kick, precisely hitting the opponent's wrist. Crack. A crisp sound, accompanied by the man's scream, the dagger fell accordingly. Miles didn't pause, following with a hand chop to the opponent's neck side. The short sturdy man didn't even hum, softly collapsing to the ground. Everything happened in a flash. The dry powder gradually dispersed, the lane in disarray. Miles panted heavily, a small wound on his forehead seeping blood, arm also cut, staining the shirt sleeve red. He first looked at me, eyes full of worry and fear. "Are you okay?" We spoke almost simultaneously. I shook my head, only then feeling my legs weak, back already soaked in cold sweat. I leaned against the cold wall, panting heavily, whole body trembling, unclear if from aftermath fear or exhaustion after overcoming the barrier. Miles quickly walked to me, his forehead still bleeding, corner of mouth bruised, eyes full of lingering ferocity and thick worry. Confirming I was unharmed, he reached out, wanting to hug me tightly. But seeing my wary gaze, stiffened in midair. Are you okay? What's with your hand?" His voice hoarse from the earlier fight and tension. Looking at his disheveled yet full of concern appearance, looking at the blood flowing from his forehead for me, the 7 years of grievance, pain, estrangement, after walking the edge of life and death, seemed really diluted some. "I'm fine." I shook my head, voice somewhat floating, superficial injury. He looked deeply at me, gaze complex, with guilt, heartache, relief of regaining what was lost. And a pure love I hadn't seen for a long time. "Raina," this time I didn't push him away. His arms tightened very much, body even still slightly trembling. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." He buried his face in my neck, voice hoarse and choking. "It's me who implicated you. It's me who didn't protect you well." Police sirens approached from afar, breaking the lane's silence. Miles had pressed the emergency alarm on his phone during the fight gap. Police quickly controlled the scene, took away the 2 thugs. As parties involved, we also needed to go back to cooperate with the investigation. After simple statements, we walked out of the police station side by side. Night had fallen, the small city lights just on. Sea breeze brushed faces, carrying coolness. We stood on the steps at the police station door, momentarily speechless. He turned his head, deeply gazing at me, moonlight casting soft contours on his face. He didn't say, "Come home with me again." "Raina," he spoke, voice low and firm, "no matter where you are, no matter what choice you make, I will guard you and Sonny." He paused, gaze burning, inside undisguised deep affection and remorse. Not out of responsibility, nor because of guilt. He said word by word, clearly, "It's because I love you." Sea breeze stirred my hair, carrying the night's coolness. I didn't answer. Just silently, together with him, walked into this gentle night. I need time, need space, to truly find back that complete, independent Raina. My journey is no longer his return path. But perhaps, the future will have intersecting harbors.